Transmissions are weird, and though most of us use them every single day, a vast majority of us don't even know how they work. It's a very similar situation to an internal combustion engine, which we've already made a video about on our channel, and I'll link that right in the upper right corner. Nonetheless, we believe it's a good idea for you to actually understand the machine that you drive and how it actually works. If you enjoy this video and find it helpful, be sure to hit the like button, definitely subscribe, and leave a comment down in the comment section if you would like to see anything else from us. But let's dive right in. A manual transmission, also known as stick shift, is different from automatic transmission. It requires the driver to manually shift the transmission and gears. A car with an automatic transmission has a brake pedal and a gas pedal inside the car. But in a manual transmission car, it actually adds an additional pedal on the left side known as the clutch pedal. A manual car will also have a different shifter. Rather than the park, reverse, neutral drive setup that an automatic has, a manual transmission car will need to be placed into specific gears to engage the transmission correctly. With that out of the way, we can start discussing the transmission itself. The transmission sits behind the engine underneath the car and is connected to the back of the engine at the bell housing. The bell housing is a large, round, bulbous part of the front of the transmission. The bell housing is responsible for holding the clutch disc, flywheel, and transmission input shaft. Let's break down each of those pieces. The flywheel is like a large gear. It is bolted to the crankshaft at the back of the engine. This part of the system is what helps start the engine of the car, which we covered in our combustion engine video linked down in the description. Directly behind the flywheel is the clutch disc. The clutch disc, as you might have guessed, is linked to the clutch pedal that we mentioned earlier. The clutch disc is a complex piece on its own. It's made up of a friction plate and a spring plate called the diaphragm spring. Finally, the transmission input shaft is the shaft that takes the power output from the engine and brings it into the transmission. The shaft is splined and connected to the clutch disc. The whole process of the transmission starts when you push down the clutch pedal inside your car. As you push the pedal down, the diaphragm spring on the clutch disc is compressed. When this happens, it causes the friction plate to be lifted off of the flywheel. This allows the engine and flywheel to spin freely without transferring power through the clutch disc into the input shaft. With no power being sent through the transmission, the car can roll freely as though the transmission is in neutral gear. Releasing the clutch pedal allows the clutch to re-engage the friction plate with the flywheel, creating the connection between the engine and the transmission input shaft. This transfers power from the engine to the gears inside the transmission. And yes, when people refer to first gear and second gear, they are referring to the actual gears inside the transmission. There are many different types of manual transmissions with different number of gears. The most common manual transmissions have anywhere between 2 and 6 gears. The transmission in this example is a 4-speed transmission. That means that it has 4 different forward driving gears. However, you can clearly see 5 sets of gears depicted in this animation. The 5th gear you see is the reverse gear, and we'll cover that later. To complicate things more, the transmission system has 3 different shafts: the input shaft, the counter shaft, and the output shaft. We have talked a little bit about the input shaft already. It is the first part of the top shaft in the animation. As previously mentioned, this part connects to the engine through the clutch and flywheel and inputs the power to the gear system. Next is the counter shaft. The counter shaft is at the bottom of the animation. It is used to transfer the power from the input shaft to the output shaft through the different gears. From there, the output shaft takes the power and sends it out of the transmission to the rear differential and tires. Let's take a closer look at how shifting gears and the transfer of power actually works. First, we need to briefly talk about the gearbox lever, the shifter itself. The shifter has the ability to move left and right, as well as forward and backward to engage the different gears when shifting. As you move the shifter, it engages with the shifter linkage, causing different pieces to move on the output shaft, engaging the different gears. So let's shift our transmission into first gear. As we let go of the clutch pedal after shifting, the engine begins to rotate the transmission input shaft. The input shaft has 1 gear directly connected to it. This gear then drives the counter shaft, causing the counter shaft to rotate. As we mentioned before, the countershaft is then responsible for transferring this rotational power to the gears on the output shaft. The gear on the output shaft, which corresponds to the first gear, connects with the driving gear on the countershaft. You can see that in this animation, the first gear is actually the fourth set of gears from the front. The connection of these two gears then drives the output shaft and outputs the power to the rear differential and tires. That's how the transfer of power works on one gear. But how does it work when shifting from one gear to another? The first thing to understand is that the gears on the output shaft are not directly connected to the shaft itself. They all rotate on their own bearings on the shaft. This allows the gears to rotate while only engaging one at a time. Because of this, the gears don't necessarily rotate at the same speed as the output shaft or the other gears themselves. So in order to ensure a smooth shift, you need a device to make the gears rotate at the same speed while still allowing them to rotate freely. Next to each of the gears on the output shaft, there's a small gear called the synchronizer ring. This synchronizer ring is linked to a gear that is connected directly to the output shaft so that this gear and the synchronizer ring are always rotating at the same speed as the output shaft. As you go to shift the gears, the shifter sleeve slides onto the synchronizer ring and pushes it into the gear. The friction from the synchronizer ring being pushed up against the gear causes the gear to rotate at the same speed as the output shaft. Then, the shifter sleeve is able to smoothly slide onto the gear and engage with the driving gear as well as the gear directly attached to the output shaft. This allows the countershaft to transfer the power through the gear and through the output shaft. It's a complicated process and hard to understand, so if you have any questions, leave them right down in the comments and we'll do our best to respond. That's how shifting gears is done in a manual transmission. But what's the difference between the gears? Why are there multiple gears that we have to shift through? Well, each gear set has a different gear ratio. This is what allows each gear to have a different maximum output speed. First gear has the lowest gear ratio, besides the reverse gear, using a small gear on the countershaft and a big gear on the output shaft. Having the power come from a small gear to a bigger gear creates a lot of torque and acceleration, but has a slower max speed. The transmission is built so that the first gear has the lowest gear ratio, outputting the most torque, and the third gear has the highest gear ratio, outputting the least torque but highest speed. However, earlier I said that this is a 4-speed transmission, not a 3-speed. The fourth gear doesn't actually use a gear ratio. It has a 1-to-1 power output by directly connecting the input and output shaft. By cutting out the countershaft and gear system, it creates the maximum speed output and minimum torque output possible. This system improves fuel efficiency drastically within the engine. This allows the car to accelerate quickly when it needs to, but also maintain a fast speed with less effort as well. All of that just to drive forward. But what about reverse? The reverse gear works a little bit differently than all the other gears inside the transmission. It actually uses a 3-gear gear train. All the other gears only use 2 gears within the train, which keeps the output shaft moving in the same direction. Adding a 3rd gear to the train between the countershaft and the output shaft causes the output shaft to rotate in the opposite direction, allowing the car to move backwards. The reverse gear is also different because it usually doesn't require a synchronizer ring. The synchronizer rings are necessary to shift between the gears while the gear shafts are rotating. However, you typically shift into or out of reverse at a stop or standstill, which the shafts aren't rotating at all, meaning that you can use the shifter to engage the 3 gears without a synchronizer ring. Now you know the mechanics behind a manual transmission. I hope this helped you understand how it all works, and if you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments and we will do our best to respond. I truly hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to hit the like button and definitely subscribe. Lastly, let us know down in the comments what you would like to see explained next on our channel. We love doing videos like this. So thank you for watching, and I hope this helped.